Welcome to War and Peace, Part 1, an interactive U.S. history tutorial for students like you. On November 11th, 1918, the Great War came to an end. Across Europe and across the world, the guns and shells at last fell silent. For more than 4 long years, the conflict we now call World War I had raged. No one dreamed when the war began in 1914 that it would last so long or cause such unimaginable death and destruction. The day is known as Armistice Day. Much of the world still celebrates it today, almost 100 years later. In America, we remember the holiday as Veterans Day. In this 2-part tutorial, you'll learn how World War I came to an end when it did, and how the Allies defeated the Central Powers with the help of the United States. Then you'll learn how the victorious Allies mapped out the post-war world at the Paris Peace Conference of 1919 with the participation of U.S. President Woodrow Wilson. You'll learn about the successes and failures of the Treaty of Versailles, which officially ended the war with Germany. And you'll learn how Woodrow Wilson tried, but failed, to bring the United States into a new era of international cooperation after the war. Finally, you'll see how the ending of World War I paved the way for World War II a generation later. Other tutorials in this series cover the causes of the war in much greater detail, as well as the experiences of Americans fighting overseas and on the home front. If you haven't completed those tutorials yet, you might want to before starting this one. Let's review some basics about World War I. At the time, before there was another world war to compare it to, it was simply called the Great War. The war began in 1914 after the Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Empire of Austria-Hungary, was assassinated in Sarajevo. This incident wasn't exactly the cause of the war, but it did trigger a complex system of alliances and war declarations that pitted the major powers of Europe against one another. The conflict ended a century of relative peace and the balance of power in Europe. The two sides in World War I are known as the Allies and the Central Powers. To start, the Allies consisted of the empires of Great Britain, France, and Russia. Japan soon joined the Allies, as did Italy in 1915, and many other nations followed. The Central Powers consisted of the empires of Germany and Austria-Hungary, as well as the Ottoman Empire, which includes modern-day Turkey. Bulgaria joined the Central Powers in 1915. The violence and death of the first months of the Great War stunned all who were involved. After early offensives failed, the war settled mostly into defensive trench warfare, in which neither side could gain much ground or achieve clear victories. World War I quickly became a stalemate with no end in sight. It also became a meat grinder for young lives. About 10 million soldiers would die in action by its end. The United States was originally determined to stay neutral, but America began to support the Allies with trade and loans. And when German submarine attacks killed Americans at sea, most famously when the ocean liner Lusitania was sunk in 1915, public opinion turned against the Germans. Still, the U.S. remained neutral. President Woodrow Wilson was even elected to a second term in 1916 on the slogan, "He kept us out of war." But in 1917, the 4th year of World War I, 2 important things happened. First, the Russian Empire dissolved into civil war. The Bolshevik Party, a group of communist revolutionaries, seized power. Russia's new government signed a peace treaty with Germany and left the Allies. This helped the Central Powers greatly. Second, after promising not to, Germany resumed unrestricted submarine warfare against Allied and American shipping. When more American ships were sunk, President Wilson asked for and received a declaration of war against Germany. After years of strained neutrality, the U.S. had joined the Allies. America had never before played this role in history, forming alliances with other nations to join a global war. The United States formally declared war on Germany in April of 1917. The American Expeditionary Force, or AEF, didn't start arriving in France until late in June of that year, and even then, the force consisted of only 14,000 out of an eventual 2 million soldiers. General John "Blackjack" Pershing, who was in charge of the army, insisted that his men be well trained before going to Europe, so troops were slow to arrive. The AEF saw only minor combat in 1917. But by 1918, over 1 million Americans were stationed in France, and the AEF saw significant action. In March, the Germans launched all-out offensives to try and end the war. In June, the AEF helped stop Germany's thrust toward Paris at the Second Battle of the Marne. American and French soldiers there overwhelmed the Germans with hundreds of tanks, beginning an Allied advance. And in fall, the AEF was part of major operations, including the Meuse-Argonne offensive, that saw Germany at long last on the ropes. American losses were high. During the Meuse-Argonne offensive, which lasted from September to November 1918, more than 26,000 men were killed and more than 95,000 were wounded. World War I was a conflict of many firsts, most of them horrible. Not only did grueling trench warfare characterize the fighting, but soldiers had to deal with barbed wire, poison gas, and airplanes that rained bullets from the skies. But the infusion of fresh blood into the Allies in the form of the AEF really did turn the tide of the war. One German opponent commented that the Americans' nerves were not yet worn out. Another called them the decisive power of the war. As the war still raged, Woodrow Wilson formulated his plan for peace when it was over. Wilson had a different point of view than the other Allied leaders, who included the prime ministers of Great Britain and France. Those men led nations who had been at war for years. They had lost hundreds of thousands of brave young men already. If they won, they wanted revenge against Germany and the Central Powers. Wilson led a nation that was still fresh to the war and less personally invested. He could afford to take a generous approach to the peace terms, looking less toward payback and more toward democracy and peace in the post-war world. In January 1918, the president delivered his 14 points speech to Congress. In it, he revealed his vision for a liberal peace. The first 5 points promised an end to secret treaties, like those that had brought about the war, and freedom of the seas in peace and in war. Barriers to free trade would be removed, and nations would begin the process of disarmament, reducing the number of weapons of war. Colonial claims would be settled in a way that gave equal weight to the rights of colonized peoples. The next 8 points proposed solutions to the territorial issues of many nations who had lost land to Germany or its allies. Wilson stressed self-determination for all peoples when resettling national borders. This meant that the people of a nation had the right to choose their own form of government and not be dominated by another. The 14th point was the most important to Woodrow Wilson. In fact, it's fair to say that it was his lifelong dream. Wilson proposed a League of Nations, a general association of nations that would guarantee political independence and territorial integrity to great and small states alike. In other words, it would be an international organization in which nations would work together to resolve conflicts and disputes without going to war. Wilson believed the League of Nations was the most important part of his plan. In fact, he went as far to say that without it, there would be no way to secure a lasting peace for the future. The 14-point speech was well received in the Allied nations and even in Germany. With public support seemingly behind him, Wilson felt confident that he would triumph in both war and peace. With the United States a full partner of the Allies, the Central Powers were losing the Great War. In September 1918, Germany's General Ludendorff had advised his government to seek the best possible peace terms to end the war. Negotiations continued through October as the war still raged. Germany hoped to seek a peace on the basis of Wilson's 14 points. The other allies weren't sure. They insisted that Germany would owe reparations payments resulting from the war. On November 3rd, Austria-Hungary, Germany's main remaining ally, dropped out of the war. By that time, the German army had been dislodged from its positions along the Meuse River in France. German survivors retreated to the north and east. For the entire war, the battles of the Western Front had been fought on French soil. Now, the Allies were pushing back in the other direction, toward Germany's border. But World War I never gave Germany a chance to truly defend its homeland. The remaining support that Germany's Kaiser Wilhelm II had enjoyed at home fell apart as the end drew near. The morale of the German people plummeted, and mutinies in the navy and uprising in the streets convinced him that he could no longer rule Germany. On November 9th, the Kaiser abdicated his throne, which means that he voluntarily gave up his title and his power. Germany was now proclaimed a republic with a new government. And 2 days later, on November 11th, at the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month of 1918, the war came to a stop. Germany's new leaders signed an armistice, a ceasefire, with their enemies. Under the terms of the armistice, Germans had to withdraw from the territories they had conquered and surrender their entire navy. This was only a temporary arrangement. The final terms of the peace were to be decided by the victorious Allies at a peace conference to be held in Paris at the start of the new year. The celebration stretched across the entire globe. After more than 4 years and as many as 20 million dead, the Great War was at last at an end. The Paris Peace Conference began on January 18, 1919. It would last more than 5 months, until June 28th, to produce the peace treaty with Germany now known as the Treaty of Versailles. Technically, World War I was not over until the final treaty was signed. There was simply an armistice or ceasefire in place until then. President Wilson was so passionate about participating in the conference that he traveled to Paris in person. No sitting president had ever crossed the Atlantic while in office, or been away from the country for so long, almost 6 months. Wilson's journey started with great promise. Parisians cheered America's president and hailed him as a hero. But during negotiations, Wilson found himself just one of many powerful men struggling to solve difficult problems. He didn't necessarily see eye to eye with the other Allied leaders, like David Lloyd George, the Prime Minister of Great Britain, and Georges Clemenceau, the Prime Minister of France. Both men considered Wilson to be naive and out of his depth. They also found him moralistic and stubborn, focusing on his beloved League of Nations with a one-track mind. Lloyd George and Clemenceau had different agendas. They were Germany's European neighbors, and they had fought the Central Powers for far longer and with far greater losses than had the United States. Now that their side had finally won the war, they wanted to get something out of it. They and the other allies wanted territories and colonies from the nations they had defeated, along with reparations, payments to make up for the damages of war. They also wanted to punish and weaken Germany to make sure that it would never be able to threaten Europe again. Wilson thought these demands were petty and short-sighted. With his plan for peace, he wasn't just seeking an end to this war, but an end to all wars. He wanted to create the conditions for a permanent world peace, and it frustrated him that the Allies didn't share his idealism. As the months went on, Woodrow Wilson had to compromise most of his ideas, including many of his 14 points. Great Britain, for example, wasn't about to give up its dominant navy for the vague idea of freedom of the seas, and the Allies wanted to control Germany's colonies rather than allow them self-determination. The experience embittered Wilson. But the president was overjoyed that the Allies agreed to form the League of Nations, the one point on which Wilson would not bend. He believed that a successful league would make all the other compromises worthwhile. On June 28, 1919, in the fabulous Hall of Mirrors in the Palace of Versailles outside Paris, the final peace treaty with Germany was signed, officially ending World War I. The final list of terms the Allies decided on is called the Treaty of Versailles. The treaty was designed to punish Germany in the way that France and Britain had desired. A war guilt clause said that Germany was solely responsible for the losses and damages caused by the entire war. Germany was required to make reparations payments to the Allies in an amount equivalent to $33 billion in 1919's currency. Today, the same amount would equal more than $452 billion. It was an impossibly large amount for Germany to pay back. In fact, that was the point. The treaty was designed to keep Germany's economy so weak that it would never have enough wealth to rebuild its military and wage war again. In addition, Germany lost territory totaling 25,000 square miles, and with that land, lost about 7 million of its citizens. You can see the divisions on the map here. The lighter beige sections of Germany were given to France, Belgium, Denmark, and the newly created nations of Poland and Czechoslovakia. Another region of Germany, the Rhineland on its border with France, was required to be a demilitarized zone. Germany would not be allowed to keep any soldiers or build any fortifications in the region. Germany's army was reduced dramatically in size, and it was allowed to maintain only a small navy and no air force whatsoever. And Germany lost all its overseas territories in Africa and the South Pacific. They became mandates of the League of Nations. Germany balked at what it considered the harsh terms of the Treaty of Versailles. When their government had signed an armistice to stop the war, Germans had hoped, even assumed, that the final peace terms would resemble Woodrow Wilson's more generous 14 points. But their leaders had no choice but to sign it. The only alternative was restarting World War I. Woodrow Wilson had not fully agreed with the terms punishing Germany. He had hoped to rebuild Europe and the world on terms that would bring people back together, not continue old hatreds and rivalries. But in the end, the American president found it better to compromise with the French, the British, and the other allies on Germany's treatment if it meant achieving the creation of the League of Nations. The Paris Peace Conference did more than just punish Germany for the Great War. The map of Europe and other parts of the world was totally redrawn by the Allies in Paris on the basis of self-determination. The Empire of Austria-Hungary, part of the losing Central Powers, ceased to exist after World War I. It was divided into the individual nations of Austria and Hungary and the brand new nations of Czechoslovakia and Yugoslavia. The boundaries of these 4 countries were drawn in an attempt to group people of like ethnicities and languages together. The former Ottoman Empire was divided as well into mandates controlled by the British and French. These included Iraq, Palestine, and Syria-Lebanon. The modern nation of Turkey was also created after the war. The redrawing of old borders created ethnic and nationalist conflicts, still alive and well today, almost a century later. Ongoing rivalries between the Greeks and Turks, between Arabs and Jews, between Shiites and Sunnis, and in the Balkans of Eastern Europe can be traced back to the decisions of 1919, when European leaders carved up the world in ways that primarily benefited their interests. Japan was also one of the winning allies represented at the conference, and the Japanese received control of Shandong province in northern China, which Germany had controlled before the war. This pleased Japan, but upset China. Tensions between the two nations would increase in the coming decades. But the Japanese were not pleased when the Allies rejected their proposal for a clause proclaiming racial equality in the Charter of the League of Nations. Basically, this clause would have said that all member states were to be treated equally by the League of Nations, regardless of the race or nationality of their people. The leaders of Great Britain, and to a lesser extent Woodrow Wilson of the United States, saw that the proposal was defeated. The Japanese considered this a great humiliation, and it hurt relations between the US and Japan in the decades to come.